Okay, so I think we'll get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this interactive roundtable discussion called Laying Out a Clear Framework for Integrating ESG Issues and Long-Term Strategy. My name is Tim Human. I'm a journalist with Corporate Secretary, as well as Corporate Secretary's sister magazine, IR Magazine, and I'll be moderating the session today. I'm delighted to say we are joined by two speakers from Chief Executives for Corporate Purpose. Brian Tomlinson, Director of Research for the CEO Investor Forum at CECP, and Michael Rosen, Head of Capital Markets Engagement for the CEO Investor Forum at CECP as well. Thank you so much for joining us today. So the way the session is going to work is Brian and Michael will give an introductory talk to set the scene, and then we will open up the conversation to everybody. So once the introduction is completed, we encourage you to switch on your video and join us here to take part in the discussion. As a housekeeping note, Brian and Michael are going to use some slides. Feel free to click on the slide to expand it so you can see it better. And then when you want to come back to the normal view, double click on the slide again, and that'll minimize it. If you have any technical questions as we go through, please pop them in the chat box to the right of the platform, and someone from Corporate Secretary will answer them for you. But without further ado, let me hand over to you, Brian and Michael.
Thank you so much, Tim. Great to be with you, and thanks for hosting our work, and very much looking forward to the conversation with the panelists. We listened into some of those sessions earlier on today, and those were really terrific, great content, and I imagine we will build on some of those in our remarks. As many of you will know, Chief Executives for Corporate Purpose was founded with a view that companies and CEOs should be a force for good in the world. And our work at the CEO Investor Forum is really aimed at enabling issuers and investors to have a conversation that's couched around long-termism and to really push back on some of those short-term pressures that we see so clearly in our capital markets. I wanted to start by just framing some of the trends that we've seen in our work with companies. Michael will add to that. And then, as you said, Tim, we'll open it up for a conversation. Much of this framing that we'll do is just really intended to prompt attendees to throw in their insights from their work as practitioners. So I wanted to highlight a few trends that we're seeing. I mean, obviously, the key framing of this is just the inexorable rise of ESG and its relevance. And there are so many different data points to illustrate that. One that we've seen again reinforced this week is just the sheer volume of funds flow that is seeking out sustainable strategies. US CIF had a paper on that just this week. The shareholder proposal process, again, year in, year out, seeing steady volume of ESG-related proposals and pretty steady vote totals in terms of the support that those are getting. Trends, again, with the institutional investors, continuing to actually adopt full ESG integration, which is starting to mean that engagement on ESG is actually really turning into a year-round activity rather than just purely kind of a proxy-related activity. And I think a lot of these trends are really supported by a lot of the data that we're seeing, around good ESG performance being associated with a good conventional sort of accounting and stock market performance. As we saw from the presentation from Edelman this morning, there is an expectation that good ESG performance it will be accompanied by a valuation premium. And indeed, we have seen from a recent McKinsey study that is also supported through their rigorous data too. And really, this is just putting ESG, to the extent it's not already on corporate agendas. We talk a lot with corporate sustainability and IR professionals in our day-to-day work. And one of the real barometers there, I thought, was the National Investor Relations Institute ESG policy statement, indicating again that engagement with ESG, particularly by IR, is really an expectation. The second theme I wanted to briefly highlight was, again, just the concern around short-termism. We hear that a great deal from the CEOs that we talk to. We hear that from the investors that we talk to, that only a small proportion of portfolio companies really setting out a long-term strategy. And we've seen SEC engagement on that with their roundtable on short-termism in public markets, and indeed their guidance earlier this year talking about the importance of forward-looking information during COVID, but actually during normal times too. In our work with companies, we're really trying to focus them on disclosing across a broader set of themes and a longer-term time horizon. You can see there's the long-term plan content framework that we share with companies. We ask them to address those themes in the context of what we call a long-term plan, which is an annually updated presentation to institutional investors and then embedded across the ecosystem of reporting to address, as you can see, quite conventional investor-facing disclosures within a broader set of themes, which are, I think, are receiving more attention, as you'll see there, such as, corporate purpose, human capital, which was extensively discussed on the last session, and risks and opportunities, which we frame particularly around those emerging ESG risks. As you'll see there, we reference corporate purpose. I think another trend is just this expectation around stakeholder capitalism. Again, in the Edelman study this morning, we saw expectations that a stakeholder outlook is likely to generate longer term returns, and it is something that institutional investors are interested in. So really just trying to see how companies can adopt a kind of stakeholder approach and then how they talk about it. And it really is an emerging theme, and I think we're very early days on that. Obviously, the BRT statement was, I think, a significant indicator of that trend. And then just to wrap a couple of things together there, I think the other issue is the way in which COVID has really accelerated some of the trends on and engagement on these themes. I think in many ways there's been a mixed picture, which is in the early part of the crisis, people were very concerned mostly about keeping the lights on and seeing how the crisis was going to develop. But it does seem to have caused much greater engagement with ESG themes, and it accelerated those engagements in disclosure contexts where you might not have previously seen much ESG data. You were mentioning our article about why companies should talk about ESG on the earnings call. That's something that actually we have seen in significant volumes, companies talking about how particularly that S in ESG is being dealt with, particularly in the context of COVID, which makes intuitive sense, but we certainly were interested to see it. And I think the final trend, before I hand over to Michael for his observations, is this concept which has come up many times today about ESG as a whole firm concept, about just the sheer extent of internal collaboration that is required and cross-function sharing within corporations to really enable companies to kind of get their arms around this internally and then work out how you talk about it. So hopefully that's a bit of provocation for the conversation that follows. Michael?
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Good to be with you all today. Just kind of one thing to mention on top of the ESG and the earnings call information that's kind of being discussed there. I actually just had a recent conversation with a company that made the Dow Jones Sustainability Index, and IR wants to kind of highlight that on an earnings call. I don't know if we would have seen that, Brian, right, a year, 2 years ago, like kind of championing that on an earnings call where there's a limited amount of time. I just think that's just it gives you an indicator for that this is important, right, to use in that time. From my observation, I spent the first, call it 15 plus years of my career on the buy side and the sell side, different roles, most recently doing corporate access at UBS, so really trying to facilitate meetings between management, right, and institutional investors. And I think, the one thing that I would say is that when you talk about ESG, it's been evolving. And I think it's really important, even more so now. I think COVID is just hockey sticking this thing up into the right in terms of importance, but really getting your arms around it, understanding it, be able to talk about it, right, to the institutional investor community. And so a lot of what I did when I was at UBS doing corporate access was really trying to bring IR up to speed and in terms of like, this is real, right? And I actually spoke to an IRO maybe a few months ago, and they told me they were kind of skeptics. And those are my favorite investor relations officers that are skeptics, that like, this is just kind of foo-foo stuff, but it's really not. And he said, Michael, this thing is not a wave, it's a tsunami. And like a lot of IROs aren't ready for it. And I think a lot of companies in general aren't ready for it. Although you are starting to see progress, and we'll talk about this, I think, going forward. So, I mean, I can go on, but I think maybe it might make sense to kind of maybe start with some of the questions that might be there, but, happy to talk about, anything that Brian talked about, as well as kind of the landscape of the ESG ecosystem, because that can be a little confusing, and, where you'd be spending your time. So I'm sure we'll talk about that in the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Brian and Michael. So I think that's a great way to set the scene for the conversation. And you've already mentioned a few areas that we could dig into there. I think there's an awful lot that we could discuss. But at this point, let me invite people who are listening in to join us in the conversation. So we really want this to be an interactive discussion, not just us talking, but hearing from you guys as well. Any questions you have, any points of view, how things are like at your organization. So anyone who's on the call now, feel free to click on the share your video option and come and join us up here and take part in the conversation. And what I thought I'd throw a question out to you guys about how companies, what sort of challenges they face when they are trying to think about how to integrate like an ESG elements into a long-term story. I mean, we all understand the drivers there, but what are some of the issues that companies face? What are some of the pain points they experience?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it's a mix of internal and external challenges. I mean, on the external side of it, it's some of the issues that Michael referenced, which is just to understand the ESG reporting system that's out there. And use the frameworks that are available in a way that works for the disclosure objectives you're trying to achieve. So, when we are talking to companies, as we're generally talking to companies who are seeking to talk about ESG and long-termism to their investors, in a sort of Reg FD setting, we're encouraging companies to use SASB as a basis for getting to kind of a baseline of smart disclosure on those key issues that are more likely to be material to their sector. So, you're not reporting on essentially just a cloud of issues. You're really narrowing in on a key set of issues. So I think that point's really key. I mean, we do hear quite a lot about the internal challenges and this is actually something where I think the practitioners would be perspective would be super interesting. Is just what is the necessary internal collaboration that's required to disclose on ESG themes. So we know that in many ways disclosure operates as a forcing function, right? In order to do new things, in order to disclose new things, you have to do new things. And what are the sort of systems of sharing that companies can put in place to respond to that? When we sort of first started with companies, talking to companies about these themes a few years ago, what was very often happening is that we were talking to companies where, the sharing between investor relations, for instance, corporate corporate sustainability and corporate secretary, was at a very emergent stage. Maybe there may have been sort of reactive responses to particular questions that come in, but there wasn't really this ongoing kind of sharing and coordination, which meant that essentially a lot of information and a lot of expertise kind of sat in silos. So I think that just two examples of some of the challenges there.
No, those are great examples. Thank you so much, Brian. And I see we've had one person join us, Derek. Thank you so much for joining the conversation.
Yes, hi.
Just great to speak to you. Just as a reminder to anyone else who's listening in as well, feel free to share your video and join the conversation as well. But Derek, maybe I'll come to you. Would it be possible for you to just introduce yourself and tell us a bit about yourself and your role?
Sure. Can you guys hear me okay? Great. So I'm Derek Wyndham. I'm Vice President and Associate General Counsel at Hewlett-Packard Enterprise. So I lead the corporate and securities legal functions. And as part of that role, which sits in the corporate secretary's office, we do a lot of the work on the disclosures and the ESG disclosures. And, just to sort of, and jump in if you had a particular question, but I did just want to follow up on the point you were making about the collaboration and the sharing when it comes to crafting ESG disclosures. And I think that is really key to have solid kind of networks of collaboration and information sharing. Because if you think about it, in order to have really meaningful disclosures on ESG, you have to understand, what is material to your business and what is material to your investors. So you have to be collaborating very closely with your investor relations teams. You have to work very closely with your HR team to understand what are the human capital management initiatives that they're measuring on and that they take actionable items on. And you have to be really understanding your different business units to understand what are the various ESG drivers that affect them. What are they seeing with their customers, suppliers? And so really you have to kind of sort of extend throughout your network and throughout the company to craft meaningful disclosures. Otherwise, you're just drafting them in a vacuum and they're not really meaningful to investors.
So Tim, could I actually just jump in there, just because I think it's a really good point that Derek mentioned. When you think about the information, this type of disclosure that investors are looking for, I think there's risk to just kind of letting it sit in silos, right? Because at the end of the day, the investor will get the information they need wherever, however they're going to get it, right? And so instead of going to, if IR, who's the owner of the investor communications channel, if IR, like I was talking about before, isn't up to speed and knowing the things that they should be talking about, right? Investors going to go to the chief sustainability officer, corporate responsibility, sometimes I've heard general counsel, right? And so that's why, Brian, you maybe jump in here, but that's why we think it's critical, right, to kind of have these ESG committees or councils, whatever you're going to call them, that meet on some kind of basis, right, and come up with what those disclosures are going to be and the information that you're going to share. So it's one cohesive, consistent, forward-looking message, right, to investors to tell them where your company's going. So I actually think it's actually a risk mitigant, right? Talk about being, counsel, to kind of streamline it all into one kind of group that kind of can get that disclosure out there in a consistent, coherent manner. So Brian, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, in terms of the companies that we've worked with today, the ones that are furthest along on this kind of disclosure maturity curve, they have set up processes and ongoing relationships for sharing across the key functions. So you'll see that companies have got structures in place for the IRO, CSO, corporate secretary, link. Other companies that are kind of just getting started and a little earlier in their development, starting to convene the internal ecosystem within the firm that holds the different pieces of data and the different functions into these kind of ESG working groups. To just make sure that you have the company ecosystem in the room, and then to facilitate sharing. And one of the challenges that we see across functions is also this concept of audiences. So if you're talking to an IRO who obviously holds the disclosure relationship with the capital markets, their view of what's important is often going to be somewhat different to the view of the sort of corporate sustainability function, which in terms of a lot of their disclosures has tended to have a different view of the audiences to which they're disclosing. It has a more of a sort of stakeholder focus than an investor focus. So I mean, actually, Derek, just with that kind of overview, it'd be interesting to get a sense of what the kind of structures you have in place for sharing that data and across the different functions, and what maybe some of the challenges of putting those in place have been.
Yeah, sure. So we actually have sort of a somewhat formalized governance structure around ESG to make sure that kind of information sharing takes place. So, we frame our ESG issues under what we call living progress. And so we have what's called the Living Progress Strategy Council. And it's a cross-functional team, made up of folks from different organizations throughout the company. And they kind of maintain oversight of ESG issues in sort of a risk and opportunity framework. And they ensure that there's kind of common alignment on what the various pieces of ESG are, what those components really mean, and where are the biggest drivers of risk and opportunity among ESG. And so once you have kind of that alignment among our Living Progress Strategy Council, we can ensure that information flows up to our board, it flows up to investor relations, it flows through the corporate secretary function. And so it really kind of ensures a consistent narrative and ensures that everyone does understand what ESG fundamentally is to our organization and what would be the most meaningful way to report out on our initiatives to our investors and shareholders.
That's really great to hear, because we've certainly seen just the dangers of the silo effect in terms of disclosure, where you've had sort of a pretty well developed sustainability reporting aperture through which information's being passed, and then if you with a broader set of audiences that it's intended for, and then you look at then what's being said more directly to investors, it often bears kind of little relation to those sorts of disclosures. So sort of working out which parts of that story are shared, I think is really critical.
I think that's a great point, because there's a lot of kind of almost hand-wringing about new ESG disclosures. We have new SEC regulations, we have requests from investors, but companies that have really been thinking in a meaningful way about ESG have done a lot of that work. Like you said, sustainability. I mean, we have a 100-page Living Progress ESG report. And so for companies that have done that work, the disclosures are there. It's now just a matter of almost just how to kind of condense those really meaty and meaningful disclosures down into, your proxy statement or your 10K or your earnings call. And so just kind of, you have the narrative, and now just tailor which aspects of it you focus on based on, your particular audience.
Right. And that's a really a key point for us. We put up our long-term plan content framework earlier, which we think kind of gives you 9 themes that are pretty critical for a company to disclose on, to give a sense of what your long-term prospects are, particularly if on these themes you're able to give longer term targets, whether or not that's longer term financial guidance or other targets in other themes here, whether it's in ESG, talking about whether it's just key targets around, for instance, climate, diversity, some of those human capital themes we mentioned earlier. And the idea is for this to provide a framework which really just synthesizes that broader disclosure universe into really what's important on this broader set of themes. To just illustrate the point, building on what you were describing, Derek, we sought to build what we describe as a long-term plan for existing companies on the strength of their existing disclosures. So, could we complete at even a boilerplate level of detail disclosure on each of these themes from existing disclosures? And we found that we could, but in order to do so, we needed to look at around about 13 different pieces of disclosure across different disclosure formats, whether or not that was, mandatory reporting formats or other, voluntary disclosures. So that means just not a terribly efficient way of accessing data, hard to interrogate what's really important. And I think, finding ways of synthesizing and reducing what's important and making sure that's calibrated to the specific audience you're talking to is absolutely key. Because, you don't want to find that you want, investors to be engaging with a sort of a key disclosure, but actually it's hard to locate, and it's in a footnote on page 123.
Right. I think Gillian, have you joined us on the conversation? Where we can't see your video, but yeah. We've got a screen. Oh, fantastic! Yeah, thank you so much for joining. We can hear you.
Oh, wonderful! Oh, great! I know for some reason this system seems not to be picking up my webcam. I was trying to join. I had actually jumped in right when Brian and Derek started talking about board reporting and board oversight of this issue, which was actually what I wanted to kind of ask the panel's views and Derek and see what other conversations people are having, because I think that board oversight aspect is of particular importance, and certainly with lots of companies that have been grappling with ESG and have a robust sustainability and a sustainability report, maybe a bit farther ahead, but certainly for lots of companies, they're just at the point this year, perhaps, in identifying what board committee might oversee these types of issues, be reported to, make critical board decisions about. And I do think that it's very important as we move into having human capital disclosure that's mandated, a continuing increase in the companies that have CSR reports and otherwise, that if an investor were to ask, or a regulator even, that there be identified in the charters of the board committees or the governance guidelines of the board itself, if the board as a whole wants to be overseeing this area, that there be something to identify the critical importance of this issue from a governance perspective. And so I know Brian and Derek were kind of already there right when I jumped in, but I think that's an important step for companies that are, especially those that are newer to this topic.
Yeah, and I think the really meta point here is just, companies want to be disclosing and managing it from a stable process. And, when we've met companies who are kind of at an earlier stage of maturity in terms of how they think about and manage ESG, it's kind of much more of a process scramble. It's not necessarily clear who holds the key data, where that is, what the oversight of it is. And so actually just building a stable governance framework is just absolutely key, and it's the key element for then creating sort of accountability and enabling progress to be made on ESG. Because I think one of the things that we're really seeing is that the early stages in sort of identification, getting to a key set of metrics, but then actually increasingly in our work, we're seeing, just the importance of target setting as well. Not just where you are on terms of ESG performance, but also where you intend to go, and kind of demonstrating that trajectory to the institutional investors that are so increasingly engaged on this topic as well.
And specifically, Brian, I mean, you're talking about putting that forward-looking lens on the likes of a SASB, right, to help support that narrative about where you're going, right?
Yeah, increasingly, just demonstrating that there are targets underlying your ESG performance. So saying where you are and saying where you're going. And we do see that those companies that are setting ESG targets, intuitively, it makes sense that those companies are also displaying greater ESG momentum, greater improvement on their material ESG themes over time. And interestingly, for those companies displaying greater ESG momentum, there do appear to be some capital markets benefits to doing that, along with the broader benefits that better ESG performance can also help in terms of your investor targeting and investor base efforts. We certainly see that if you can demonstrate kind of competence and progress on ESG issues, you'll tend to attract more longer term focused investors into your investor base. And sort of going back to that short-termism issue, that's can do a world of good in terms of just the managing the amount of pressure that you get from the capital markets in terms of the pressure to make short-term moves, because many of those longer-term focused investors just simply regard things like a short-term earnings miss as being just simply less salient than the longer-term prospects of your business on those key ESG themes, which tend to play out over sort of medium to long term. But I think to go back to Gillian's point, it's absolutely correct that where this really has to start is with setting in place reasonable and well-structured governance efforts on which you can then stably build a process for managing and disclosing these themes.
And I think one of the challenges a number of companies have when thinking about their governance framework, and as Gillian mentioned, which committee should the ESG oversight sit with? I think one of the challenges is companies think, well, we're already sort of doing this in various pieces of the board. Your human capital issues may sit with the comp committee, and governance issues with the nominating committee, and some of the risks to the business and environmental risks may sit with audit, and or some at the full board level. And so sometimes companies think and look, well, we're doing this among the various board committees. We don't need a more formal structure. But I think it is helpful to have a committee, at our company, it sits with the governance committee that maybe not does all of the ESG work in that committee, but maintains oversight for ensuring it gets done within the company, and the various board committees are each overseeing their piece of it. So other committees in the full board may actually be doing real work with ESG, but I think it's good to have one committee maintaining the full kind of holistic oversight to ensure that ESG risk and opportunity framework is being done.
Thank you so much, Derek. We've still got about 7 or 8 minutes left. So just as a reminder, if anyone has been listening in and enjoying the conversation, but has a question that they'd love to ask, but hasn't had the chance to ask it yet, please feel free to join, switch your video on, and have a conversation with us. So there's a few different things we haven't touched on yet. I thought I'd throw out a question there about the different reporting frameworks. We've already mentioned that just in passing a little bit, but that's something that when companies are thinking about how they're going to report on this, what the material factors are. Like, there's a lot of different options out there. There's a bit of an alphabet soup of different frameworks. I mean, Brian and Michael, just in the work that you're doing with companies, what sort of those options, to what extent is it helpful or hindering that there's lots of different options? How are you sort of talking to companies about what's out there?
Yeah, so we really think about this in terms of materiality and audiences. So you've got to fit the framework to the audience that you're seeking to reach. So, in our work, it's mostly about issuers talking to their talking to institutional investors. Institutional investors want to hear about those ESG factors that are financially material. That naturally directs you towards SASB, which has that sort of industry-specific financially material focus, which again, I think helps narrow what can seem a dizzying array of issues. I think to the uninitiated, ESG can just appear like we want companies to report about everything. And I think what the sort of analytical architecture that SASB provides does is say, no, actually, it's, the materiality of ESG issues varies systematically by sector. And so therefore, here is a relatively narrow set of issues to get you to smart disclosure. Now, we don't want slavish following of frameworks. We want to ensure that companies are, accurately, reflecting what their issues are, and so and reflecting the idiosyncrasies of their business model, the things that a framework can't capture. But we certainly start with that kind of baseline. That really helps us, I think, narrow that dizzying reporting framework world. However, you may also need to think about the other side of materiality, which is well, what is the impact of our company on our stakeholders and so on, and kind of complete the picture on value using a broader set of frameworks. Now, naturally, the one that people use the most tends to be GRI, and we think there is some use to that too if you're trying to communicate that kind of holistic story. And then I suppose there is that roiling kind of acronym bingo of ratings and rankings, and I think one of the ways in which companies can help simplify that is again by just engaging with their investors. Asking your top holders. I'm sure many of you are doing this. Which are the data providers whose work you use? Who do you regard positively? What's the data that we need to provide to enable those to accurately capture our performance on key ESG themes. So again, I think that's just an area where the investor community can actually help issuers kind of decomplexify what does seem to be an unnecessarily large universe of acronyms.
Can I just jump in, because I have a very strong view about the ESG ratings, and that I think Brian knows this, but just from my perspective, being on the buy side and sell side, I wouldn't be beholden to the ESG ratings and not manage to that. There's this seminal study out of MIT from Professor Rigobon and his colleagues that look at a concept called aggregate confusion, and that's basically that black box that each of these ESG ratings providers have. That's their secret sauce to generate, the revenue, right? To get so my point being is that's a black box, hard to manage to kind of get your score up, right? So kind of our view is kind of own your message and tell how you're going to get there. That will eventually get into that black box, and your score will eventually improve, right? Because it's all about what's financially material to you. And Brian talked about this, SASB, but then also what investors want to know at the end of the day is what are the 3, 4, 5 most financially material risk factors to your business, right? Set those forward-looking targets and tell us how you're going to get there, and then update us ongoing, right? And that builds credibility with management and other things. But that's what at least the active managers, and I should have specified that, fundamental active management, that's what they're looking for. So I just think it's important not to put too much weight into the ESG ratings, because all these investors, by the way, especially the long onlys, they have their own internal rating system. They're not using the ratings, they're using the underlying data, right, from the MSCIs, the Sustainalytics, all those folks, and then flexing and weighting and putting their own little secret, box, right, to generate their alpha so they can earn their management fee, right? So I won't worry too much about your ESG ratings. Really just own that forward-looking narrative. The rest will take care of itself. That would be my recommendation, my unsolicited recommendation.
Very much, Michael. And thank you, Brian, as well, for your perspective. I mean, Derek, just to bring you in here, I don't know, just based on that conversation, talking about selecting the most material issues and making use of different reporting, in your experience there, and to what extent have you found those frameworks useful?
Yeah, so I would agree 100% with what Brian and Michael both said. I mean, it all comes down to your understanding what your investors want and what is important to them. It all comes down to shareholder engagement. And that's why it's so important, to Michael's point, it's so important to make ESG kind of a real substantive and ongoing piece of the dialogue, so that your investors really do understand what you're doing from an ESG perspective, how you view risk and opportunity. And those are things, I mean, the indices are great, and they have, lots of different methodologies. Some are more straightforward than others, some are black boxes, but understanding how a company views risk and opportunity is something that's harder to measure, I think, than progress on predefined ESG initiatives. And really how you view ESG risk and opportunity is what I think is most meaningful to investors. And so as Michael kind of mentioned, you really have to drive this narrative. Don't rely so much on the indices. They are there, and you should pay attention to them. And we do. I mean, it's almost a full-time job for people, as you mentioned. It's an alphabet soup. And so kind of triaging through them to understand what is meaningful, what is relevant to your company and relevant to your investor base takes a lot of time. But don't lose sight of the fact that there's a more straightforward way of getting your message across, which is talking and engaging with your shareholders.
Yeah, and if I might jump in, I think that Michael's point about year-over-year assessment of measures is a really important thing for companies to focus on, because when you're identifying measures, and particularly as we move to more mandated disclosures that'll be part of companies' liability, their disclosure committees need to be able to assess and validate these numbers. It's really important for companies to be thoughtful about the measures that they're choosing, and if they'll be able to measure them year over year, and if they're the type of measure that may have significant swings, and if so, if they'll be able to describe those swings, which I could imagine not only will be something that investors care a lot about, but something the SEC could care a lot about and start to indicate in comments as they go through 10Ks and other disclosures. How are you measuring, or what is your process and your validation process for measuring something if we see year over year such an impactful change in that measurement? And so some of the areas that are coming up, certainly in the human capital space, although companies may have measured them in prior years or maybe didn't, they didn't necessarily measure them with an eye toward disclosure and an eye toward the compliance and validation issues that they're going to see now. So I think that's something to keep in mind.
No, it's a great point. Thank you very much, Gillian. Well, I think we're coming to the end of our session here. I think one of the main sessions is about to start again on the main stage. But I just wanted to give you guys a chance, if anybody had any other final points they wanted to bring up before we closed here. But if not, thank you so much. First of all, to all of you guys listening in to the session. I hope you found it useful. I certainly found it very interesting. Thank you so much to Brian, Michael, Derek, and Gillian as well for joining us. I think it's been a really interesting discussion, and yeah, I've really enjoyed it. Thank you, guys, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of the conference. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone. Stay safe.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us on, Tim. Appreciate it.